The sea and the skies are not safe in Standard. Find out what decks can ground the competition coming up right now.
As if 4 big Standard events last weekend wasn't enough to wet your whistle for Magic the Gathering action, there were 4 more giant Standard Magic the Gathering events to really satisfy your spell-slinging appetite for Standard this past weekend. Not to be outdone by the Western Hemisphere, the Eastern Hemisphere had 4 of its own regional championship events across Southeast Asia, China, Australia, New Zealand, and Korea/Japan, as almost 1,000 individual spell slingers wound up going head-to-head in a Standard format that is going to be looking a little similar, with a couple of mutations and differentiations from just the last couple events we had the previous weekend. So without further ado, we're going to jump into this video and look at all 4 of those events combined and take a look at the metagame breakdown as a whole across all of those events to see what is up and down from just the past weekend of Standard action. After that, we're going to be looking at what was the most popular across these events using our popularity tier analysis and really kind of combining those top tier decks against one another, or putting them head to head against one another, so that you can figure out what you want to do for your last couple of RCQ weekends, or if you have some Magic the Gathering online events to spell sling at yourselves. Then we're going to be looking at the top 10 win rate decks, not only in no sample size, but also 4 or more sample size. That way we're going to be looking at the decks that the Brewer's Paradise can kind of go for, as well as those who are looking to really make or break the metagame and figuring out what is attacking the top of the tables, or what is just plain succeeding. After that, we're going to look at the top 10 presence decks, put them head to head against each other in a matchup matrix, and figure out what the Standard Magic the Gathering metagame looks like as a whole. Before we jump into the breakdown though, let's talk about where the data is coming from, and as always, we're using the Melee platform's breakdown of all of these 4 events. Thankfully, all of them wound up using Melee, so I didn't really have to change around anything with my calculations. However, one thing I did have to change around was a lot of the archetypes and how that they were filed across all these different events. Part of it is just because I believe there's some language barriers too. Melee is in English, and not everybody is going to have the exact specific name of the English deck or know exactly what to look for. So because of this, I have over 200 individual deck list changes to narrow it down to 112 unique archetypes that were played across these 4 events. Some of this was as easy as identifying mono green as mono green landfall, or something a little bit different like a mono green aggro, which was no landfall and just really small things bashing people's heads in. And some of it was a little bit more unique, as I took some of the Wooburg labeled kind of archetypes and broke it down to something a little bit more digestible in case you wanted to kind of scour through those deck lists and figure out what was really popping off this past weekend, or something catches your eye. If you want to see a changelog of all that, I posted it on my social media in the description down below. You can find it there and figure out all the different changes that I've made. However, we are looking at all of the rounds of these events, including the top 8, and as always, buys do not count, ties do, unless you're looking at win rate minus ties. So let's dive into what made up this past Standard weekend. As I just mentioned, across these 4 different Standard events, there were 112 unique archetypes, and none of them were missing deck lists. However, 50 different deck archetypes were the only version of their deck in the events, making up 44.6% of the deck archetype share. Now, if you want to look at the different pilots that had the same idea, so the different archetypes with at least 2 decks in the events, 19 different deck archetypes made up 17% of the deck share metagame. Moving on to different archetypes with at least 3 copies across the events, there were 9 of those. It made up 8% of the deck share metagame. If you want to bump that number up to 4 different copies of an archetype, there were only 3 archetypes across these 4 events that met that criteria. It did make up 2.7% of the deck share metagame. We're skipping up to different archetypes that had at least 6 copies across the events. There were 5 of those, making up 4.5% of the deck share metagame. And if you want to look at different archetypes that had at least 7, 8, or 9 different copies across these events, there were 2 archetypes for each of those points, making up 1.8% of the deck share metagame, all of their own. If you wanted to look at all the different deck archetypes with at least double-digit copies played this weekend, there were 20 of those, making up the upper edges of the metagame. That makes up 17.9% of the deck share metagame. At the top of all of these different deck archetypes reigned Izzet Prowess. 156 different pilots made up 16% of the metagame share, as the spell-slinging, hard-hitting deck archetype was number 1 again this past weekend. Right below it though, not to be outdone, Mono Green Landfall, 132 different decks made up 13.6% of the metagame share, an equally fast and equally furious but mono-colored version of an aggressive strategy is still topping the standard metagame chart. Now just below that, Dimir Midrange made up 72 different pilots across these events, so it was 7.4% of the deck metagame. And meanwhile, Izzet Lessons fell down a couple of notches, but matched Dimir Midrange this time around. Again, 72 different copies of that deck, making up 7.4% of the metagame share. So these kind of tried and true staples of the standard format are still fighting in the top 10 presence, although in different numbers than what we've seen the past couple of weekends. Now, a different Izzet deck is its Spellementals, the third one in these top decks here. 61 different copies of that deck made up 6.3% of the metagame share across these 4 events. And then, not to be outdone by the color duo, yet another Dimir deck was here. Dimir Excruciator falling down in popularity, 4.7% of the metagame share, as only 46 pilots wound up bringing this deck to events this weekend. Out with the old and in with the new, Momo White made up 4.3% in the metagame share this weekend, as 42 different pilots took the Mono White Springleaf Drum Acceleration deck to play and had some mixed success. Bant Rhythm, 36 different decks made up 3.7% of the metagame share, taking the spot from Simic Rhythm as the most played Badger Mole Cub Nature's Rhythm style of deck this weekend. Jeskai Control is still hanging on with 21 different pilots making up 2.2% of the metagame share overall, while in 10th place as the top 10 presence decks comes to an end, Ban Airbending also just barely holding on there, 1.7% of the metagame share from 17 different pilots across these 4 events.
Now it's time for us to shift gears away from what made up the event as a whole and just focus on what was most popular at the event using my popularity tier analysis. Now this section looks to identify what was played the most at an event and compare it to the other decks within the same tier of popularity using a distribution of deck archetypes at the event, which uses standard deviation to assign tiers from D at 1 deviation below the average all the way up to S, the highest deviation above the average. Now this does a little more than just look at how high the metagame share was and can reaffirm if a deck was a good choice for an event at all. Now, while this is not a be-all, end-all overview of the format, this analysis looks to help in preparation for your own events at your LGS or online, as you can expect to see more of the higher tier decks compared to the lower tier ones, but then you can also assess if you need to prepare more or less for them based on their performance. Now, the popularity tiers were a bit more top-heavy thanks to the fact that Izzet, Prowess, and Mono Green Landfall had triple digits and the rest of the deck archetypes did not. And while there are 112 different deck archetypes, that does mean that when you hit that triple-digit area, you're going to be bumped up into that S tier. Easy peasy. Now, both of these decks had extremely successful weekends across all of the events, even averaged out across all of the pilots. Izzet Prowess continues to put up massive results. A 54.7% win rate against the field is absurd and kind of approaching the VV Cauldron, Izzet Cauldron numbers. So the kind of core style of the spell slinging aspect of those Izzet decks has been around for quite some time, whether it be Corey Steelcutter, whether it be Izzet Cauldron, whether it be other versions of this Prowess deck. It's just hanging around and still one of the best things to do in Standard, specifically now that people have kind of figured out Elusive Otter is a very difficult to block creature that has to be played around in the early games and then potentially could be sideboarded out as big hitters like Eddie Merc Crab then come in to kind of stomp decks that are looking at these smaller removal packages. Mono Green Landfall is still hanging on as one of the most played and highest win rate decks in general. 51.1% win rate is a little bit lower than the last couple of weekends. However, an above 50% win rate with this massive amount of presence is still something to be extremely proud of. The Landfall pilots are still kind of figuring out the best shells, whether you're going for like the big butts with the green shell, where you're wind up going for things that are going a little bit bigger in the overall if you're playing 2, 4, however many sapling nurseries. As long as you have Earthbender Ascension, you have your Mightform Harmonizer, and you have things like Bossing Say and Fetch Lands, Mono Green Landfall is a great place to be regardless of the open or closed event that you might be attending for Standard. A tier has some favorites in Izzet Lessons and Dimir Midrange, as well as Izzet Spellementals, another one of those spell-slingy kind of decks that is going to be taking advantage once again of Eddie Merc Crab, Hearth Elemental, and Sunderflock, and the cost reduction that you get from that off of your elementals being reduced by the rest of your spells and sorceries and everything that you're casting. But regardless, the pair of Izzet decks came in just
under 50% win rate, which is not the worst thing in the world, specifically when you're comparing it to Dimir Midrange here in this tier. Now, against an open field of decks, the sub 50% win rate by just a couple of percentage points isn't going to be a make or break deal of the power of the deck in the format, but specifically when talking about Izzet Spellementals, we've seen in previous weekends that the deck has a lower or higher win rate based on how many creature-based decks are kind of getting played and how good the power of an early Sunderflock really is. This past weekend across 4 different events, it was still pretty good, albeit slightly below average. The Izzet Lessons was 0.1 percentage points lower than it, so by all means, it means it's the worst deck. Not really. Izzet Lessons still has a lot of things that can iterate on. There are less pilots playing it now, specifically because the Prowess matchup is something that we can talk about a little bit later that may be hindering some of the way that the Izzet Lessons pilots are approaching the metagame. Now, Dimir Midrange in and of itself, you would think that if the Prowess deck was going to be playing like 1 or 2 threats, that the spot removal deck was going to be pretty darn good into it, but it turns out that when you put into the Floodmaw and a bunch of other things like that, and of course Stormchaser's talent and Boomerang basics into the mix of things, Dimir Midrange struggles against those 2 cards specifically. So Dimir Midrange overall, though, is also suffering just based on the different decks that are popping up in the metagame right now. So if you're an Izzet pilot, things aren't looking all too bad. If you're a Dimir pilot, you might want to be looking at the configuration of your deck and make sure that you're attacking the right parts of your local metagame before you sleeve up your Kaitos this way. Going down into B tier, things still don't look the worst in the world. Dimir Excruciator actually looking a lot better than its mid-range cousin at 49.3% win rate. Now that the pressure's off and there are lesser pilots playing it, it's maybe a little bit more pilot specialty type deck, and it is a little bit more control-y, so when things are going into, you know, multiple prowess creatures and things like that, you have board wipes and you have backup plans, you have a long grindy game that Dimir mid-range as a more tempo-y kind of deck doesn't necessarily have and can get overrun a lot easier. Now the Bant Rhythm deck we talked about a little bit earlier, it was the most present Badger Mole Cub Nature's Rhythm deck and put up some pretty decent results because of it. Now we've seen as Badger Mole Cub becomes less and less of the kind of figurehead of standard that it is doing better and better against the field of different standard decks. Even though decks are still packing their low drop removal to deal with Cub and company, it's still putting up decent results because it can overwhelm decks that don't necessarily prepare for it. I know a lot of people don't necessarily like the fact that this exists in the format. However, if you are under preparing for Badger Mole Cub, you're going to get run over by it. If you are preparing adequately or even more so, then you're going to absolutely smash those styles of deck. We'll talk a little bit more about the Bant Rhythm deck when we get to the head-to-head and potentially some of the higher win rate matchups here to see what pilots are doing to iterate on this deck to make it a little bit more advantaged against the field of decks. Meanwhile, the Momo White deck, unfortunately for Momo and Springleaf Drum, it completely tanked in play rate once it wound up shooting up and pilots being playing it. Whether it's because of the fact that the deck is very susceptible to board wipes and doesn't necessarily have a good backup plan besides like play more creatures or play more creatures faster, Sage of the Skies, Momo, and Springleaf Drum suffered a 47.1% win rate against the entire field. However, the Momo deck does have its own strengths and weaknesses, and when we get to the head-to-head matchup matrix, since this is one of the top 10 presence decks, we'll get to dive in a little bit deeper where Momo White might be the right choice. A large swath of decks across C tier. We're not necessarily going to hit on absolutely all of them. However, one deck that I do really want to highlight has the highest win rate in this tier and the highest win rate of the popularity tier decks in general, which is Temur Harmonizer. This Splinter Twin-esque deck has kind of fallen off of the cliff in popularity once its win rate started going downward, and I really do think that this one kind of comes down to how the pilots are playing the deck and how comfortable they feel. If they're Harmonizer pilots by and large, awesome. If they were picking up the deck because it had a high win rate, it looks like they're dropping it. 56.9% win rate against the field. Whether people are under-preparing because it's less popular or the pilots are more specialty, the deck is putting up results now that we're seeing smaller numbers of it in the field. Likewise, we're seeing Izzet Elementals make a bit of a resurgence. This is like that Roaming Throne, Ashling, and like Monodork kind of style of elemental play, where you're getting like that real Omnath vibes with all of your Evoke Elementals and trying to double their triggers and everything. This one's putting up a 53.7% win rate against the field. You can't really play Torpor Orbs and stuff into this deck because then it just smashes you with 5 and 6 power creatures basically for 2 mana over and over and over again. Boros Tokens is putting up some results as well. We separated it from the Arabella and the standard aggro style of decks, so if you're going to be putting a bunch of tokens into play, a more mobilize-y, war leaders call type style, 51.5% win rate against the entire field. That does kind of still show that proactive style decks have a space to go in standard, and it's just not all reacting what your opponents are doing. Now, unfortunately, some of the decks that want to set up their own engines are not performing as well in the face of these proactive decks. I want to highlight the lowest win rate here in C tier, and one of the lower win rates we looked at overall, save for, unfortunately, Dimir Midrange. It is Grixis Monument. This deck has gotten a couple of cool tools. We've seen the Monument to Endurance package with the Iron Shield Elves and the Flails, and then putting Quantum Riddler in there to really restock your hands and everything. Some of them have even gone into adding copies of Cool But Rude, but unfortunately all it's done is be rude to their win rate. 42.9% against the field. The deck might just be a little bit too slow or have too many pieces against some of the more aggressive decks that are coming out of the standard metagame right now. And then, just very quickly, I do want to highlight Boros Dragons. Now, this deck was spiking in win rate not that long ago, but now that the Momo decks are adding Springleaf Drone and going a little bit smaller, the Dragons deck isn't necessarily having the same oomph against things like the random Cub decks and things like that were making up a larger amount of the metagame previously. Even though the deck isn't as popular anymore, the win rate is kind of showing why pilots are going away from it. 44% win rate overall this past weekend does go to show that if you want to play the Boros Momo style of deck, playing more aggressive might be a little bit better than playing bigger, badder dragons. Let's step away from the popularity contest and instead look at what decks were doing the most winning, regardless of how many copies were in the room at the event. Now, this is going to be looking at overall win rate and the percentage of games won, not total wins or total games played. This is going to allow us to look for some of those sleeper OP decks, even though they weren't out in full force this weekend, and it's going to be able to put that in perspective based on how successful they were in the hands of smaller amounts of pilots. Now, the caveat is these are 2-day events, which means that some of these lists could have not made day 2 despite having a positive record. So as always, keep in mind the sample size because it does matter when you're thinking about breaking the format. Golgari Reanimator is only one angle of attack that pilot Paul Gabat put into his deck, as Kona Rescue Beastie was the backup plan to put things from Valgaboth to Vaultborn Tyrant directly into play. Zuko's Conviction is the reanimation spell of choice. For just 1 black mana at instant speed, you're able to raise dead and put it back into your hand, but you're able to basically zombify instant speed if you pay an extra kicker of 4, so 5 mana altogether. Even though the deck didn't necessarily have, the cheapest curve of way to put things into play, still playing things like Overlord of the Baelmerk, milling things into your graveyard, discarding things alongside of it, and then reanimating at instant speed or dropping something from your hand like a Galta Stampede Tyrant that could put everything else into play as well, thanks to Kona tapping and stationing one of your lands or something along those lines, was an angle of attack that not everybody was prepared for this weekend. 7-2-1 record for a 70% win rate overall makes it the highest win rate deck across these 4 events, even though there's just 1 copy. Honest Boros Burn by Timothy Sandford was the second highest, or tied for second highest win rate deck this past weekend. And don't let the 5-3-0 record fool you. This isn't like an NA or EU RC where that means it doesn't make day 2. These are smaller RCs, so these records are good enough for the top 64. This is 37th place at the Austria-New Zealand event, so this deck was doing good stuff this weekend with just good and honest Boros Charm, Lightning Helix, Burst Lightning, cards like Nova Hellkite, Slick Shot Show Off, and even though we don't have Lava Spike, we have Bolt Wave in standard. Case of the Crimson Pulse is helping you refuel. High Noon in the sideboard was slowing down other decks so that your 1 or 2 burn spells on their turn or your turn were enough to end the game. And then hate pieces like Rest in Peace and prime removal like Get Lost was just enough to push Timothy across the finish line into 37th place this weekend. Not quite Grixis Affinity, but 4-color Affinity, thanks to running multiple copies of Dusk Rose Reliquary in this 5-3-0 tied for second place deck on the weekend. This is again a deck using Pinnacle Emissary and Krang Mastermind in order to, do basically Affinity things. Heck, Krang says Affinity on it, so we're calling this deck Affinity. Improvised Arsenal is basically your cranial plating while you're trying to spell sling as many artifacts into play to reduce the cost of your Krang, draw a ton of cards, pump its power up, and all in the meanwhile, you can play a Pinnacle Emissary or even just warp it very early on and get an army of 1/1s that are going to be helping you to do the exact same thing. So you're going to wind up having big things, a wide board, and just doing things that these modern power level cards are able to do even in Standard, despite the fact that there aren't the zero cost activators in order to reduce the cost super duper early. I was a little torn on where to put this one as a quote unquote Sultai Elementals or more of a Sultai mid-range deck. However, pilot Ian Cormick wound up playing this, what I decided to call Elementals list, to a 5-3-0 record, tying for the second highest win rate across the weekend. Now this is going to be playing things like Ashling, although it does have Superior Spider-Man to see and Bringer of the Last Gift in the list as well, so it does have those Reanimator style things. But then Glarb Calamity's Augur is a main deck card in this list as well, because everything in your deck besides like Ashling is going to meet that 4 or higher mana cost part that Glarb needs in order to cast it from the top of your library. So you're going to have a lot of kind of cool synergies going on here. Cavernous Souls makes the deck, Oscorp Industries makes the deck as well. So there's just a bunch of things going on in what is a very good grindy advantage mid-range style deck that can just so happen to play the Superior Spider-Man and Bringer of the Last Gift combination to put all of these elementals back into play, although there is one Arden hiding out in the list as well. Another one of your Badger Mole Cub Nature's Rhythm style decks, the Temur Rhythm deck in this case, main deck Explosive Prodigy, and hits that 62.5% win rate at a 5-3-0 record as well, tying it for second place win rate overall on the entire weekend. Now there is only one version of this deck that stayed strictly Temur and didn't wind up playing Bright Glass Gear Hulk or other things like that, and while the deck doesn't necessarily have a ton of innovations besides running the Explosive Prodigy package in the main deck, it is something that the Simic and the Bant list don't really have, so it's very cool to kind of section it out and see how that one kind of performs in a vacuum to see if the power of Explosive Prodigy and some of the other ways that you can wind up building the deck is worth putting into those Bant, or in that case would be 4-color rhythm decks we'll see a little later. No, you didn't misread that. A Sultai control list had 2 different pilots, a 13-8-0 record, and the 6th highest win rate at 61.9% across the weekend. Now, the highest placing list from Hiroaki Itou was a straight up control list using Consult the Star Charts, Rakshasha's Bargain, all this card advantage. It used a copy of the Soul Stone to get a little bit of extra mono ramp. It wound up having Urgent Necropsy, which is just a very powerful instant speed destruction on multiple things spell, and then close the game out with either Meringue River Region or Wan Shi Tong Librarian. It did wind up having one Sphinx of Forgotten Lore in the main deck, which could provide some flashback to any number of spells that you wanted to wind up casting again. You had multiple copies of Deadly Cover-Up, which is always a funny thing to do if you're able to collect evidence against Landfall and, take their forest out of their deck, but it's just another way to deal with a bunch of things that are being played to the board, as well as a plethora of on the stack or on the battlefield low mana interaction, Requiting Hex, Spell Snares, Shoot the Sheriffs, everything you could really think of. Post sideboard, you do have a couple of extra creatures in here. You have Unagi of Kyoshi Island, you have Moreland, Devourer of Spiders to pump a little extra mana into it and just deal some damage and stabilize, as well as 3 copies of Nowhere to Run is just a very, very solid removal spell. Not to be outdone by all the other color pairs of rhythm decks, Selesnya Rhythm has entered the battlefield. 8-5-0 for a 61.5% win rate is not the same as the quote-unquote Temur list. However, this Selesnya Rhythm list went without blue entirely. No Mockingbirds, no Quantum Riddlers, no sorts of Unable to Screams or anything like that. It was just all of the white hate cards and the tutorable cards such as Seam Rip that you were going to be getting from those Bant style decks as well. Bright Glass Gear Hulk was up in some numbers, and because of this, the Selesnya deck was able to kind of still do the very similar things that the Simic and the Bant versions of the Rhythm deck were doing, albeit a little bit more streamlined and a little bit more creature heavy. Spoiler alert, it was a good weekend to be a Rhythm deck, it looks like. Another version of the deck, this one the 4-color version, had 2 different pilots, an 11-6-1 win rate and record, and a 61.1% win rate, good enough for 8th place overall. Now what this deck was doing was combining what we just talked about with Selesnya,
what we're talking about Simic, and what we're talking about the quote-unquote Temur version. It ran Explosive Prodigy, Bright Glass Gearhulk, a plethora of one-drops that it could tutor for, including the blue cards, but also main decked a copy of Beza the Bounding Spring in this version of the deck, which wound up being a way to buffer against some of the more aggressive strategies, put a couple of different advantages onto your battlefield or into your hand by restocking your hand with a couple of card advantage from Beza. Basically, it gave you another tutor package for your rhythm that a lot of people weren't necessarily expecting to be there, let alone be in the main deck. Now, I really like these Golgari Landfall decks we're about to talk about because it's basically mono green with Requiting Hex in the main deck and then a crap ton of black removal, hand disruption, and hate cards in the sideboard. So this is basically going to be playing like mono green, but playing like duress in order to hit your control opponents, or playing the Requiting Hexes and shoot the sheriffs and stuff like that to give you a little bit of extra game, or trample through blockers from the creature-based decks. All in all, this is basically mono green Landfall, although there were two specific pilots that built their deck this way, combining for a 13-9-0 record, which is 59.1% win rate, compared to like the 100-something mono green pilots that were making up a 51.1 or something like that % win rate on the weekend. Regardless, highlighting the fact that splashing black even for sideboard cards does potentially raise your win rate a tiny bit. Last but not least, 3 different pilots took Izzet Blink to a 14-9-1 combined record, giving it 10th place overall in our top 10 win rate decks with a 58.3% win rate against the field. This is sort of the standard scam deck, not the elemental ones doing the elemental scam thing. This is just straight up Quantum Riddler, Splash Portal, and Thunder Trap Trainer, giving you card advantage upon card advantage upon card advantage. A lot of these decks were labeled Izzet Control because they do play a more grindy, slow game, but you end up having Storm Chaser's talent, you have Boomerang basics, you have Ral, Crackling Wit, but the main thing that this deck is doing that the other Izzet decks aren't is Splash Portal on a Quantum Riddler, Splash Portal on a Thunder Trap Trainer, and being able to net you a card as well. It is just a way to kind of cheat things into play, or cheat value out of the cards that you're doing or putting on the battlefield in order to play that control style of game. Now, you may have noticed that a lot of the decks in the previous section were what I like to call one-day wonders. There's maybe 1 or 2 copies of the deck, and they didn't have that deep of a run into the tournament, so we don't have a very large sample size as to test how strong they are against the metagame. Well, this next section is going to be looking at pretty much the exact same win rate statistics that we were looking at previously, only now sample size matters. We are only looking at deck archetypes that had at least 4 or more copies into the room, so you're going to get a better picture of how these decks did against the field, and this is where you're going to be looking for some of those sleeper rogue decks that could break out in the format over the next couple of weeks with some tweaking. We mentioned it a little bit earlier, but Temur Harmonizer is the highest win rate deck when it comes to decks with at least 4 or more copies across these events. 41-29-2 combined record is good enough for a 56.9% win rate and good enough for the #1 Sly here on this list. Now, some pilots still want to do that quote-unquote Splinter Twin thing and put a full bore on a Might Form Harmonizer, stack your landfall triggers, double your power, good enough to just one-shot somebody. Being able to play stock up and play this like a combo control deck gives you big advantages against a lot of the creature-based decks in the format, and against some of the decks that just have one-for-one kind of trading of removal, as you just stock your hand full of interaction and ways to wind up playing on the stack against those types of things. Might Form Harmonizer in and of itself with full bore can absolutely destroy somebody, and some decks are playing just Might Form Harmonizer as the only way to win the game. Other decks are branching into things like Quantum Riddler's mainboard and sideboard, playing a bunch of different creatures alongside it, playing Ice Tail Explorers and things like that, but a decent number of decks are still just using the Might Form Harmonizer as the main way to win the game, and although other decks were previously prepared for this sort of combo control shell, now that they are less popular, it is putting up high results. Speaking of high results, a 54.7% win rate from the most played deck across these events. Izzet Prowess, 156 different copies, and just going to show the powerhouse it is in the standard format right now. Now, we're highlighting Slickshot Show Off. It could be Elusive Otter. It could be the fact that these decks are also now main decking some number of Eddie Mert Crab in a couple of different versions of the deck, so that some of the decks that are just main boarding, Requiting Hexes and stuff like that, don't have the same firepower to deal with a giant 5/5 Eddymerc crab that is now only going to cost like 3 or 2 mana because of all the opting and sleight of handing that the deck has done to kind of set up those turns earlier than before. Now, of course, you still can plot a Slick Shot show off. You can boomerang bounce back your Storm Chaser's talent all you want. You can grind out immense value with the deck. The one thing that the deck doesn't do as well as it used to, though, is mulligan. This deck is going to want to be able to get the cards that you really want to interact with in your hand. Into the Flood Maw is almost more important now than it has been in previous versions of the deck to really kind of allow you to pop off, specifically with decks like Azorius Tempo main decking High Noon. So making sure that you have the right interaction in your opening hand for the deck that you are playing against is going to greatly improve your win rate if you're thinking about playing Prowess. Again, with the Izzet Elementals, 11 copies making 53.7% win rate, the third highest for this section of the win rate decks. Now, all in all, this deck is doing some really cool things. It's able to put these Elementals out extremely early, especially with a Flame Braider on turn 2 or an Ashling. You're able to play 2 of these Elementals and evoke them onto the battlefield, get massive amounts of value. You're also able to just kind of skip up your curve a little bit and put a Roaming Throne into play ahead of schedule, and then every single evoke elemental afterwards is going to get massive amounts of value. I love referring to this deck as like the quote-unquote Omnath deck of the format, even though it's doing a lot of more unfair things than like the Pioneer versions of Omnath. This is more like the Yorion Omnath evoke elemental modern style of deck, where you're getting so much value out of just these big cards that you're able to keep in your hand, and then later on when you have the mana advantage, or you're able to been ramping out a little bit more because you have those ways to cheat on mana in this deck, you are going to be able to double trigger with these big bad elementals and just quickly close out a game. Esper Pixie had a really solid weekend last weekend, even though there were much fewer decks played, and this time around 6 copies made a 23-19-1 record for a 53.5% win rate. Now, although the different pilots had some slight variations in the way that they were building the list, whether it was Pixie, Kieran, and that was basically it, or if there was a plethora of other creatures to really kind of support all these bounce shenanigans, one thing was clear: these versions of the deck were not using Momo and Springleaf Drum, and Kaito, Bane of Nightmares, is still extremely present in a lot of these lists. So by bouncing back and forth with your Tiny Bones joins up, nowhere to runs, momentum breakers, and keeping the board clear, you're able to close out the game with things like Voice of Victories, Kaitos, all these different ways to kind of sneak damage across the battlefield. And as you continue to bounce your way across all of the different creature decks that are being played and kind of beat them up, you do have to be a little wary, because your long game against decks that are able to recover quickly, like Temur Harmonizer, or the decks that are playing a little bit more of a slow and controlly game plan, is a little bit weaker than what we've seen with some of like the different Momo decks that can build up a board. Alright, let's talk more about Bant Rhythm here, because this deck is using Bright Glass Gearhulk, Mockingbird, and Badgermole Cub in really, really cool ways. All in all, the versions of this deck are basically streamlined Simic lists with a Bright Glass Gearhulk tutor package. Being able to tutor up a Mockingbird to copy the best thing on your battlefield is always a cool thing to do, but when you can tutor up Mockingbird alongside something else, it's even more beneficial. A Melt Strider's Resolve, so that you're able to put something on a bigger creature and then clear the way. You end up able to find like a Seam Rip and wind up getting rid of a key hate piece or something like a High Noon. All of these tutorable things make the deck a toolbox of versatility. The Bant Rhythm decks specifically are not running Explosive Prodigy, but bumping up into 4 colors doesn't necessarily cost you anything when the main way of casting the spell is to Nature's Rhythm it onto the battlefield. Now, you can't necessarily grab it with Bright Glass Gearhulk, so that does reduce the value of Gearhulk a little bit, and it does kind of fight the slots that Mockingbird is usually taking up. Some lists are down to 1 Mockingbird, some lists are running 3 or potentially a full 4. All in all, though, Mockingbird does get better when you're running Gearhulk alongside it, and the Bant versions of this deck just continue to show that even in higher quantities, they are one of the more powerful ways to play the Rhythm Badgermole Cub deck. Another weekend, another time to talk about Mono Green Landfall being one of the highest win rate decks in the format. I just don't entirely know what's going to stop this deck from being as dominant as it is. It has 132 different pilots. It's the second most played deck on the weekend, and it's the 6th highest win rate overall when you're looking at any decks with 4 or more copies in this event. 51.1% win rate. I mean, I've talked about this deck a lot already. I've talked about the fact that it does greatly increase in win rate with pilot skill, but the deck in and of itself, as long as you are able to kind of play out your fetch lands and understand how they interact with things like Bossing Say or maximize their effect with those types of cards and Might Form Harmonizer in play, the deck isn't necessarily ultra difficult. You don't need to have a degree in mathematics to play this style of deck. And because of this, it is a little bit more friendly being an aggressive style of deck. Even if you don't play the deck perfectly optimal, you are still going to win a large majority of the games because using things like Badgermole Cub and Ice-Till Explorer into Earthbender's Ascension and Might Form Harmonizer just wins games based on power level of the deck. If you are not playing mono green Landfall or even attempting to play the deck, finding out how it works and seeing if you are successful with the deck is something you should be doing in Standard because it is a mainstay over the last month or so of the format. Now, if green isn't your style as an aggressive mage, then you can check out Boros Tokens. Even though it had a 51.5% win rate at a 35, 33, and 0 record, this is the second week in a row that these Boros aggressive style decks have put up pretty solid results. World Eater's Call was something that the Convoke decks were utilizing for a little while to really push across some extra damage, but all the mobilized creatures in Standard right now are not only perfect to synergize with World Eater's Call, but if they go unblocked because they're just 1/1s, you can put multiple 1/1s into play with the Last Ronin's technique, which then does 3 additional damage with a World Eater's Call. It's basically a gleeful demolition like from the old Convoke days. So all in all, this deck does have a little bit more oomph than people are giving it credit for. The fact that Voice of Victory also shuts off your opponent's interaction on your turn means that they can't necessarily like kill one of your little tokens that's sneaking through and bursting into 3 more. So this deck has sneaky amounts of damage, can end games pretty quickly, and all in all has some pretty interesting sideboard options too, given the fact that it's a red-white deck. You don't necessarily have to play things like High Noon and things like that, but you have Rest in Peace to not have to worry about your opponent's graveyard at all, and you have great removal spells like Get Lost or potentially even cards like Seamrib to deal with all the different creatures that are plaguing the Standard format right now. For color control, the quote-unquote Jeskai Black control put up some pretty solid results, 36, 32, and 3 record for a 50.7% win rate on the weekend. Good enough for 8th place overall, and although the decks are kind of figuring out what their main win conditions are, aside from the 3 to 4 copies of Jeskai Revelation, the 3 to 4 copies of Inevitable Defeat, Wan Chi Tong, Meringue River Regent, Northwind Avatar, all these different cards are floating around within the deck list as well, but you end up having these 2 powerful cards that are making up the 4 colors of mono you really want to cast. You have your stock ups, your Consult the Star charts, and a lot of interaction. Day of Judgment, Split Ups, Ultimas, whatever kind of board wipes you could really go for. You have your No More Lies, you have your Spell Snares, you have all these different kinds of removal spells, your Get Lost and everything. You have answers for basically every single occasion in Standard. Now, whether you're drawing them, finding them, or have the right mana to play them in time is an entirely different story. And because of those things I just talked about, the deck's win rate is not even higher than it is here, even though there are a lot of creature-based decks going around Standard. Alright, here's Boros Momo. It's a little bit different than the Boros Dragons list floating around, and some of the lists are still packing things like Nova Hellkite, but for the most part they're packing burn spells, alongside what is basically the Momo white deck of Momo, Springleaf Drum, Halia, Voice of Victory, Sage of the Skies, etc, etc. Some of them are only running Burst Lightning and Nova Hellkite, some of them are going up to Boros Charm and Lightning Helix. Regardless of that, 12 different pilots wound up going 46, 43, and 3 on the weekend for a solid 50% overall win rate, but a higher win rate than the other deck on this list when you factor in the no ties. And that other deck was Bant Airbending. Despite having more games played than the Boros Momo deck, it had a lower overall win rate because it still had the same number of ties, just more wins and losses played altogether. 17 different pilots still had a 50% win rate, which is rounding out our 10th highest win rate deck of the weekend. Now, I mentioned in the last video that people are experimenting with different versions of Airbending. One of the highest placing lists this past weekend was one that was utilizing manifest cards to try to cheat some of these airbending combo pieces onto the battlefield face down, and then airbend them back to the other side when their opponents least expected it. Even though that deck got 8 wins altogether, it didn't necessarily place high enough to really make a dent in the RC overall. And while the airbending pilots are still kind of finding out if their deck is good or bad as the metagame ebbs and flows around them, overall they're giving them a solid 50-50. So if you're an airbending pilot and you are innovating on different things, don't stop, because the deck is still doing pretty decent just based on these cards you see on your screen. So those were the decks that did the most winning, but let's pivot back to the most present decks and see how they did when put head to head against one another. Like winning, but in a different metric. Now, I like to take a look at this specific matchup matrix because it gives us insight into what you should expect to play against if you decide to try one of the top decks, and how it should stack up against your own RCQ, Magic the Gathering, online league, metagame, or any other sort of event you're going to go to in just a short amount of time after this video. Again, keep in mind sample size of these matchups, as not every deck played as many games against all the others. Izzet Prowess pilots have been eating good the past couple of weekends, as your deck solidly looks like the best deck in the format with a 56.3% non-mirror matchup win rate across over 1,000 matches. Yeah, it's a pretty good place to be if you're an Izzet Prowess pilot. Now, if you are watching this and you are not an Izzet Prowess pilot, then you probably want to see what the heck beats this deck. Well, looking at the top 10 presence decks in the format, not a lot, unfortunately. Now, Mono Green Landfall is putting up not the greatest numbers. You have a 58.2% win rate in that head-to-head if you're the Prowess pilot. Dimir Midrange is, like I said in the earlier stages of the popularity breakdown, the Dimir Midrange deck, the 1-for-1 removal, is just not good enough the way that the Prowess pilots are playing nowadays, especially with Storm Chaser's talent and Boomerang basics in the mix. You have a 55% win rate for the Prowess deck against Lessons. I know that a lot of the Lessons pilots think that this is closer to 50-50 than it actually looks in this breakdown. However, I think that is a pilot skill-based matchup, and it could go either way depending on how practiced you are with the decks. Dimir Excruciator is still a very good matchup for you, 57.7% against the deck that is a combo control style of deck, although not necessarily the same way that like Temur Harmonizer is trying to do. And then the Rhythm decks, you're a little faster, and those Cubs can't jump, so you're flying over them. They have very little interaction for what you're doing. And even the control and airbending decks, they just aren't able to keep up with what you're putting on the battlefield. Now, if you are one of these players that is looking for what beats Prowess, you want to look at specifically Momo White. 34.1% win rate for the Prowess decks. That is because the Prowess decks are playing a lot of cantrips and a lot of card advantage and a lot of bounce spells. The Momo White deck has ways to generate a lot of mana advantage early, and if you are bouncing a bunch of small things that are slowly growing, especially with Abandoned Air Temple and things like that, it's not the greatest look for you. Sage of the Sky specifically is a very difficult card for you to deal with, as putting 2/2/3 flyers onto the battlefield is not great. You can bounce the copy, but you can't bounce the main one, because then they'll just put 2 more onto the battlefield after that. So being able to stonewall what the Prowess deck is doing is what makes Momo White so powerful in this matchup. On the flip side, we also have Izzet Spellementals. The spell slinging deck that is able to land a Sunderflock can really disrupt a lot of what you're doing, and since they have a lot of low cost burn based removal, they're able to really burn through either your creatures or the resources you have to pump them up for an all-out attack. Now, because of this, you are not necessarily the worst matchup in the world, but a 44.6% win rate for the Prowess deck means that this is something that you can struggle with, specifically once they hit like the flashing and Eddie Merc crab to tap down all your stuff level of play. Mono Green Landfall's 51.6% win rate against the non-mirror matches of the metagame has it in a solid place in the metagame overall. Even though it struggles a little bit against the Prowess matchup, as unfortunately a lot of those creatures can fly or just are difficult for you to block with any of the things you're putting on the battlefield, no matter how big they can get, the rest of the metagame, or at least the top tables of the metagame, are looking pretty solid for you. The only really shaky matchup you have is against the Bant Rhythm deck, because they can race you, put a lot of things on the battlefield, and absolutely run you over with a Crater Hoof Behemoth. Now, on the plus side, the Bant Rhythm deck and the Rhythm decks in general are making up a much lower percentage of the metagame overall. But as the fact that Mono Green Landfall sees more and more play, the Rhythm decks may also see more and more play as we see them continue to put up like above 50% win rates across the past couple of weekends. The other deck you really don't want to see is, hey, look, Momo White again. 48.9% win rate for Landfall isn't the worst win rate overall, but the Momo white deck again can put a lot of stone walls on the battlefield. Even though you have ways to make your creatures trample or pseudo unblockable, you don't necessarily have the way of racing a big wide board that grows larger and larger unless you are able to have a very fast start in and of yourself. Now the rest of the metagame though, it looks like it is a cakewalk. You're running over Dimir Midrange, you're running over Dimir Excruciator. If there's any other Dimir list in the building, you're probably also running it over. A lot of the other Izzet decks, the Lessons and Spellementals decks, you're also doing pretty well against. Now, specifically against Spellementals, you think that, oh, I have Sauce Chocobos and stuff, it's not going to be the greatest thing in the world. But you also have Bossing Say, and you have the warping of a Might Form Harmonizer you can kind of do at will that does dodge their Sunderflock turn, and unless they have a bunch of things on the battlefield already, you're going to survive to trample them over. Dimir Midrange doesn't look any better when you factor out all the mirror matches. A 42.2% win rate is probably the lowest we're going to see in this head-to-head matchup matrix, which is unfortunate because Dimir Midrange is looking a lot better, and I was kind of going back on the fact that the deck wasn't necessarily the thing to be playing a few weeks ago. Unfortunately, not only is the Izzet Lessons matchup still something that's a lot difficult for you, but two other decks are at the top of the tables in the metagame that are also difficult for you. Izzet Prowess and Mono Green Landfall. None of these three decks are a higher than 39.1% win rate matchup for Dimir. That means that if you're going to be playing against a field that has popular decks, you should not be bringing Dimir to that event. However, if you are playing against creature-based decks and the lesser of the top 10 presence decks, your Spellementals, your Jeskai controls, if you're playing against decks like Bant Airbending, Dimir Midrange still does have game. Unfortunately for Dimir pilots, the Cub decks are back in force, and if you're not necessarily running your spell snares and your requiting hexes, you're going to get run over by all of those Badgermole Cub turns. Likewise, Momo White is a nightmare for Dimir midrange pilots. Dea Black Sun can only do so much when those Momo creatures are growing in power and toughness across the battlefield. Khazar Zenith, giant butt-ended statted creatures, Sage of the Skies getting up to 4 or 5 toughness based off of a couple of +1/+1 counters. Very difficult for the deck to deal with if it doesn't have a bunch of mana laying around. Your 1-for-1 answers are only really good on turn 1 and 2, and later on down the line you can just absolutely get overwhelmed. So Dimir midrange pilots, you might want to kind of figure out a way to deal with a board wide of creatures, or wait until the Momo decks get less popular and you can really focus your deck on targeting those top end of the table decks. Lessons pilots might be sweating a little bit since their overall win rate doesn't necessarily look that bad. However, their specific head-to-head matchups are starting to fluctuate a little bit. We know that the Prowess matchup, we talked about that in the Prowess section. A lot of the Lessons pilots thinks it's closer to 50-50 than what it looks like on paper here. Again, I feel like this is a pilot skill-based matchup. If you're really good at Lessons, this is going to be a 50-50 or slightly advantaged matchup for you. If you're not necessarily as practiced or your Prowess opponent is very good at their deck, it's going to be a disadvantageous matchup for you. I wouldn't read super duper deep into this being one-sided or another. Just practice your deck and you're going to wind up getting better at that head-to-head specifically. Mono Green Landfall though, still pretty fast, it's still pretty furious, and it's still able to dodge a lot of what the interaction that our deck is packing. 42.3% win rate, and I don't know if that one's going to be fixed much more soon unless we start changing some of the sideboard options from the Lessons decks. Izzet Spellementals, the Spell Slingy deck? Actually, this one I believe was a little bit more in Lessons' favor, close to 50-50, but not necessarily that way in the previous couple of weekends. Something else is going to happen here. The Spellementals deck is picking up some extra percentage points in win rate here, 42.9% win rate. We only have 42 matches as a sample size, so I wouldn't read too much into it. Maybe across like 100 matches or so, this gets closer to that 50-50 number. Regardless though, if this deck is going to be out-tempoing you because the Lessons deck can be a little slow to play to the battlefield, maybe more copies of cards like Into the Floodmon stuff to bounce your monuments and bounce your artist talents to set you behind, it's something to kind of consider if you're playing Lessons. And the Momo White deck is actually very dangerous for you. You're packing things like Get Lost to get rid of some of the cards that you actually play on the battlefield, but otherwise, while you're playing Grand, Artist Talent, and Monument to Endurance, they have like 7 things on the battlefield thanks to Momo and Springleaf Drum powering through, and Khazar Zenith to bump up that entire board gets them out of Iroh's Demonstration or even Pyroclasm Rain from post-sideboard games very, very quickly. So your board wipes are not good against that deck, and they're beating you up because of it. Now we know that Spellementals is a spell slingy deck that does pretty good against creature-based decks, but where else in the metagame is it really attacking? Where is it picking up some of these higher percentage points and win rate? Well, against the field overall, it only has a 49.3% non-mirror match win rate, which is pretty close to 50%, but just below average. So that either means that people aren't playing a ton of creatures, which we know is kind of false, or it's not doing 100% of the things that we want it to against those creature-based decks. So let's take a look at this head-to-head matchup matrix and find those creature decks. Bant Rhythm, it's still doing some really good things against the Rhythm decks. I think that Thunderflock is an absolute house against Badgermole and Company, or Badgermole Cub and Company, not just regular Badgermole, but I think that card is a house in those matches, and I don't think this is going to get any better for the Rhythm decks. It will only get better for the Spellementals list. Now, the other decks that are playing a bit more creatures, like Mono Green Landfall and Izzet Prowess, you're favored in the Prowess matchup, but not so much in the Mono Green Landfall matchup. I mentioned cards like Bossing Say, and a lot of like the warp cards like Mightform Harmonizer being a little bit more difficult for you to deal with your Sorcery Speed Thunderflock, and you only have so many Into the Flood Maws to play against a deck that is playing lands and things like that. Now, you are also struggling against the Momo White deck, and this one I find kind of interesting because Momo White plays a lot of things to the board, and you have Thunderflock, so you should, in theory, be pretty good against it. Now, it could just be the speed of Momo White, or it could be the fact that some of them are packing cards like Dryad Militant to really just remove the instants and sorcery cards from your graveyard, so you can never get the discount on your elementals, and then therefore never get the discount on your Thunderflock. They're able to play cards like Rest in Peace from their sideboard as well, so this might be a kind of thing where the Momo White deck gets more powerful in sideboard matches, which is really hurting the overall win rate for Spellementals. Dimir Excruciator palettes have been experimenting a little bit more, from the Boros to a bunch of different kind of one-ofs and fun-ofs in the creature package in the main deck, and I do think that the pilots are moving a little bit more away from a standard control deck and playing it a little bit more like a mid-range combo deck instead, but I don't necessarily know if that's what the deck should be doing. Against decks like Izzet Prowess, we're seeing win rate drops, 42.3% win rate overall. Mono Green Landfall, 30.3% win rate overall. I don't think these two decks were like great matchups for the control-y version of Excruciator in the first place, so like don't get me misconstrued on that fact. I just don't know if playing, more creatures is the way to go in that specific matchup. However, one of the cool things that Dimir Excruciator is doing, though, is beating up some of the other creature-based decks. It's still pretty good against Rhythm decks, and it's doing pretty good against Momo White as well. 66.7% win rate in 15 matches isn't the highest sample size, but it's a pretty solid win rate. It's also doing good things against Izzet Spellementals, just going to show that when you're only playing a couple of creatures that really matter, once Doomsday Excruciator hits the board, it doesn't really matter what your opponent is going to do. You have a Risen Reef on the battlefield. It's very difficult for a Thunderflock to deal with that whatsoever. Now, Dimir Excruciator deck will probably benefit if people start picking up decks that do well against Prowess. One of those decks was the Momo White deck, so if we see more Momo White, we'll potentially see Dimir Excruciator pass above 50% win rate overall. I've been itching to talk about Momo White since I started looking at this analysis here, because this deck is super interesting. Momo White went skyrocketing in popularity this past weekend, and overall, it doesn't look like it makes sense why. 47.0% non-mirror win rate is not a good place for a deck to be. However, look at this matchup spread. The head-to-head matches for Momo White destroy the top 5 decks in the metagame breakdown. It's positive win rate against Izzet Prowess, Mono Green Landfall, Dimir Midrange, Izzet Lessons, and Izzet Spellementals. And while the Mono Green Landfall and Izzet Spellementals list of matchups are not the highest in its favor, it is still favored against half of the top decks in the metagame. That's why it's being played so much and why it actually is putting up win rate. But then you look at the rest of the matchup matrix. 33.3% against Dimir Excruciator, 45.5% against the Bant Rhythm deck, 7.7% against Jeskai Control, and 0 matches won against Airbending. This deck is meant to battle those top decks, and it doesn't do a whole lot against anything else. You can't play the same hate pieces that Azorius Tempo is playing because you can't High Noon yourself and only playing 1 spell per turn. You can't necessarily pack yourself full of removal because you need to be double spelling. Yes, you can play things like Get Lost, Seam Rip, and low cost interaction, but it does eventually cap you out at a certain point. So it's really, really interesting to see how Momo White is going to evolve these next couple of of weeks, because the deck in and of itself should be very, very strong, specifically at the RCQ kind of level. But if you were playing against a store format that a lot of unknown decks are at, Momo White is not the best choice. But if you're at a try-hard store and they only play that top tier of the metagame, show up with Springleaf Drum and Momo and run them over, baby. Bant Rhythm just goes to show that Badger Mole Cub will not die. It has solid win rates against Mono Green Landfall, Dimir Midrange, and Izzet Lessons, but is struggling in a couple of other areas in the metagame, specifically against the Izzet Prowess deck, which is going to be something problematic if you want to kind of take this to a larger event, when Prowess is the highest played deck in Standard. Now, the Cub decks do lose out against a lot of interactive decks and a lot of decks that can interact with cheap things, so it has a very difficult time combating against the Dimir Excruciator list, as well as struggling against the Jeskai control list. You don't have a lot of interactions, so you're not really good at combating what Momo White is trying to do, and you are basically stone cold dead to ban Airbending, specifically in game number 1. However, against the field of decks that are trying to arm themselves against a plethora of things, you still have your Badger Mole Cub nut draws, making up a 53% non-mirror win rate against the field of Standard. Jeskai control without the black is still topping the charts in presence here, with a 48.2% win rate whether you look at no mirrors or mirrors overall. What the deck is doing very well is attacking a lot of the to-the-board decks. When you're playing Day of Judgment and Ultimas and things like that, you're going to have a really good time against decks that play a bunch of creatures and pass the turn. Momo White and Bant Rhythm are decks that do that. You have a lot of on the stack interaction as well, so you're going to have ways to deal with what Bant Airbending is trying to do. Unfortunately, you don't have all of the answers you need against Izzet Prowess, specifically when they're looping Storm Chaser's talent and Boomerang basics. You have to deal with that, and then they have a plotted Slickshot show off that if you don't deal with, you just die. And likewise, the Izzet Lessons deck is very, very difficult for you to deal with. They are an engine-based deck, but they can just kind of play a patient waiting game, specifically when loading up with like Accumulate Wisdom and things like that. And if you start interacting with their actual lessons, then they land their engine pieces, and it's a little bit of a doomsday scenario for you. Likewise, Mono Green Landfall has ways they can avoid your board wipes, and if you just run out of on the stack or on the battlefield interaction, they will run you out of life total. Last but not least, we have Bant Airbending rounding out the top 10 of this head-to-head matchup matrix, and although the deck overall is a solid 50-50, whether you count non-mirrors or overall win rate, it's not looking the hottest when you look at some of the top metagame decks in the format right now. It is struggling against 6 of the different lists in this top 10 list, and one of those lists is not struggling against Izzet itself, so that doesn't necessarily count. So it's going to be struggling against things like Izzet Prowess, the Dimir Midrange list, the Izzet Lessons list, although we don't have the largest sample size right now just because of how low people are on playing Airbending in general, based on the fact that, in general, this matchup spread, you add a couple of other matches into it, it's going to be plus or minus a couple of percentage points. You're just unfavored against a majority of the top metagame decks, whereas opposed to the field, you are still able to kind of pull out your combo and potentially back up mid-range game plan of flipping an Aang and running people over. While the different versions of Airbending are probably going to be a little better or worse against a lot of these different parts of the metagame overall, one thing for certain is the fact that if you expect a lot of mono green landfall, you may be a-okay to try playing the Aang crew, because it has a pretty solid matchup there. 61.1% win rate over this past weekend. It's only 18 match sample size, but you are able to interact with their kind of cards in a way that a lot of the other control and interactive style decks just can't do. So if you'd like to see a lot of landfall, play some Airbending. If you are seeing a lot of other things and you really want to sleeve up Badger Mole Cub, maybe take a look back at those rhythm lists, at least for a week or so.
I haven't really looked at the schedule yet, but I'm just going to assume that after 8 back-to-back events, I also didn't count how many back-to-backs I said there's not going to be a lot of big events coming up within the next week or two. So that means that Standard is going to be going through iterations mostly at the RCQ level as well as online. So what are you going to be bringing to your LGS or to your Magic the Gathering online or arena queues to battle in Standard? Let me know in the comments down below, and while you're there, give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed all the recap coverage and the fact that we were able to combine all of these events into kind of one big breakdown to get a very pretty painted picture of the standard format. Also, while you are there, if any of these deck archetypes have caught your eye and you're looking at slinging some spells at your LGS, I would highly suggest using my ManaPool affiliate link down below in the description. You're going to be able to get some bonus mana from that. I'm going to be able to get a little support from you utilizing that link down there. So if you want to spell sling cardboard in person, utilize ManaPool, order your cards, get them delivered to you fast and easy using that link below. Although if you are more of the player that likes to play online, you can also find down below my Mana Traders link so you can get those cards rented on Magic the Gathering Online. Mana Traders is a platform that allows you to rent the cards rather than needing to buy absolutely all of them for just subscribing to their service. All the details and everything are on their website, and if you use my code down below, you are able to get a little bit extra and again support the channel just by playing some Magic. And if you are so inclined to help support the channel in other ways, down below or on my channel's homepage, you could click the join button to become one of my members. Members do get awesome members benefits such as early access to all my content. Tier 2 subscribers get your Discord access as well, so you can throw in deck lists, chat with me basically all hours of the day, and then just, you know, I should be working, but hey, I'm going to wind up talking about Magic the Gathering as much as possible. But in addition to that, they monetarily help support this and all videos on my channel. So if becoming a member and supporting the channel that way is something that you would like to enjoy, click the join button down below or on my channel's homepage to show your devotion. Now, it would always be very, very nice if you could just tap that subscribe button. It'll help you stay up to date on all my latest metagame analysis, deck techs, and just in general, Magic the Gathering content. I got some gameplay footage, I got some deck ideas, I got some really cool stuff, and it'll all be coming up in the next couple of videos. So, see you there.